The air itself was a hostage, captured and held tight by the suffocating grip of 100 anxieties. It tasted of asphalt baking under the afternoon sun, of the acrid tang of burnt coffee from a dozen styrofoam cups, and of the low, electric hum of impending violence. Police cruisers formed a jagged, glittering blue and red barricade, their lights painting silent, screaming strokes across the faces of buildings, and the wide, fearful eyes of the onlookers kept at a safe distance. At the center of this maelstrom of controlled chaos was the First National Bank, a stoic granite building that had become a pressure cooker. Inside, a man, a boy, really, was holding 3 employees and 2 customers, his desperation a live wire no one knew how to cut. At the heart of the police perimeter, a mobile command center had been hastily established. It was a sterile, refrigerated box on wheels, a world away from the heat and tension of the street. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone from the humming electronics and the palpable, suffocating ego of one man, SWAT Commander Thorne. He was a monument to tactical certainty, carved from hardened muscle and condescending authority. His head was shaved, his jaw was a granite block, and his eyes were hidden behind the impenetrable mirror of Oakley sunglasses, reflecting the world back on itself without letting any of it in. His voice, a percussive bark, filled the small space, each word a hammer blow meant to forge reality into the shape of his will. He moved with a predator's economy, a coiled spring of controlled aggression, his black tactical gear creaking like the harness of some terrible war machine. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to win. Standing just outside the orbit of Thorne's gravitational pull, almost invisible against the backdrop of uniformed bodies, was Arthur Finch. He was the antithesis of the commander, a study in quiet fallibility. Where Thorne was a solid wall of certainty, Arthur was a question mark. His clothes, a simple tweed jacket over a faded button-down shirt, seemed to belong to another, gentler era. His hair was a soft, unruly gray, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a deep, unshakable calm, the kind of stillness found at the bottom of a well. But what people noticed first, what defined him in the brutal calculus of a first impression, was his stutter. It was not a slight hesitation, but a profound, physical struggle, a chasm that opened up between his thoughts and their expression, forcing him to fight for every syllable. He stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, observing, his gaze moving from the bank's impassive facade to the frantic energy of the command post, his expression one of deep, sorrowful concentration. He was a man listening to a song that no one else could hear. The situation inside the bank was deteriorating. The initial crackle of communication over the negotiator's line had devolved into ragged bursts of panicked shouting from the hostage-taker, followed by long, terrifying silences. Commander Thorne slammed a fist on the metal console, making the monitors jump. The sound was like a gunshot in the confined space. He's unstable. A junkie or a psycho, doesn't matter. He's losing it. The window for talk is closed. He pointed a thick, gloved finger at a schematic of the bank displayed on a screen. Breaching Team Alpha goes through the rear service entrance. Bravo Team, flashbangs through the front windows. We go in hard, we go in fast. Dynamic entry. 5 minutes. His men, younger versions of himself, nodded in grim, almost eager unison. To them, this was the moment they had trained for. This was the test. Arthur Finch felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the command post's aggressive air conditioning. He watched Thorne, saw the glint of pride, the hunger for decisive action. He saw a man holding a hammer to whom every problem looked like a nail. But Arthur saw something different on the grainy security feed of the bank's interior. He saw the way the young man, Leo, held the gun, not with the confident grip of a professional, but with the trembling, two-handed awkwardness of someone who was more afraid of the weapon than anyone he was pointing it at. He saw the rapid, frantic scanning of his eyes, the jerky, paranoid movements. This was not a predator. This was prey, cornered and terrified. Moving with a deliberation that seemed impossibly slow amidst the frantic energy, Arthur stepped toward the open door of the command van. He had to try. He cleared his throat, the sound barely audible over the hum of equipment. "See, Commander," he began. The word was a mountain he had to climb. Thorne, in the middle of issuing another clipped order, stopped. He turned slowly, his mirrored glasses fixing on the unassuming man in the tweed jacket. He didn't see a person. He saw an interruption. "What?" Thorne barked, the single word dripping with impatience. Arthur took a breath, steeling himself for the inevitable battle with his own voice. The boy," he said, forcing the sounds out. "He's not a hardened key criminal. He's having a psychotic break. You go in there with guns blazing, and he'll react on pure instinct. People will die. You're cornering him." Thorne stared for a beat, his head cocked. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his lips. It was a cruel, dismissive thing. "The boy," he sneered. "He's got a 9mm and 5 innocent people. Your expert psychological profile is touching but irrelevant." Let me talk to him," Arthur said, the words costing him a visible effort. Each syllable was a weight he had to lift. Just give me a radio. Give me 10 minutes?" The request hung in the air for a moment, and then the dam of professional decorum broke. Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like tearing metal. It was a signal. The other SWAT officers in the van, who had been watching with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance, joined in. Their laughter was a wave of ridicule, washing over Arthur. It was loud, callous, and utterly humiliating. They looked at him, this strange, stuttering man, and saw only weakness, a pathetic joke. "Talk to him," Thorne bellowed, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. You can barely get a sentence out, pal. What are you going to do, stutter him into submission?" He mimicked Arthur's speech impediment, the mockery crude and vicious. The other officers howled, slapping their thighs. The sound was a physical blow to Arthur. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks, a flush of shame and anger, but his expression remained placid, his posture unchanged. He was a stone wall, and their laughter was just wind. "This is a professional police operation," Thorne continued, his tone shifting from mockery to menace as he stepped out of the van, invading Arthur's personal space. He loomed over him, a mountain of tactical gear and arrogance. "We don't have time for bleeding-heart civilians with speech impediments getting in the way. Now get the hell out of my perimeter before I have you arrested for obstruction." He punctuated the command with a sharp, dismissive shove to Arthur's shoulder. It wasn't hard, but it was deeply insulting, a gesture of utter contempt. Arthur stumbled back a step, catching his balance. He didn't say another word. He simply held the commander's gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his calm blue eyes there was not fear or humiliation, but a profound and terrifying pity. Then he turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd of uniforms and flashing lights. As Arthur retreated, a single gunshot cracked from within the bank. It was sharp, definitive, and it electrified the air. A woman in the distant crowd screamed. Instantly, the laughter in the command post died. Thorne's face hardened into a mask of grim justification. He spun around, his voice a roar that cut through the sudden tension. "That's it! He's fired his weapon. He's crossed the line. Protocol is clear. Threat escalated." He stabbed a finger at his second-in-command. "Tell Alpha and Bravo they are green-lit. We breach in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Go, go, go." The command post exploded into a frenzy of purposeful activity. Radio chatter became a cacophony of clipped, urgent calls. The methodical preparation became a frantic race against a clock that was now ticking down to potential carnage. To Thorne, the gunshot was not a cry for help. It was an invitation. Watching from the edge of the scene was Officer Miller, a young patrolman whose uniform was still crisp, his face still holding the earnest, slightly overwhelmed look of a rookie. He had witnessed the entire exchange. Arthur's quiet plea, Thorne's brutal mockery, the casual cruelty of the shove. But while the other officers had laughed, Miller had felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. There was something about the stuttering man, a deep, resonant authority that had nothing to do with rank or volume. And then, as the man turned away, the memory hit him like a physical jolt. Crestwood, the old iron bridge over the gorge, a decorated war veteran, lost in the fog of PTSD, standing on the edge, a pistol to his own head. The police had been helpless, their bullhorns and shouted pleas only making him more agitated. And then this man, this same quiet, unassuming man, had walked out onto the bridge alone, unarmed. Miller, just a teenager then, had watched from the police line. He remembered the man's stutter, the halting, patient cadence of his voice carrying on the wind. He hadn't commanded the veteran. He had listened. For 2 hours he had just stood there, absorbing the man's pain, until the veteran had finally lowered the gun and collapsed into his arms. The man's name was Finch. Arthur Finch. It was a local legend, a story told to rookies to teach them that sometimes the best weapon was silence. Seeing him here now, being treated with such contempt, felt like a sacrilege. Miller knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that Thorne was making a catastrophic mistake. He saw the SWAT team checking their weapons, the grim finality in their movements. He saw the 2-minute clock ticking down in his mind. He had to do something. Risking the wrath of his superiors, he broke from his post and hurried after Arthur, catching him by the elbow just as he was about to be swallowed by the crowd. "Mr. Finch," Miller said, his voice breathless. "It's you, isn't it? From Crestwood, the bridge over the gorge. I was there. I saw you." Arthur stopped. He turned to look at the young officer, his blue eyes searching Miller's face. He saw the genuine respect, the desperate urgency. He gave a single, slow nod. "They're going to kill him," Miller said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Thorne's sending them in. He's not listening. Is there anyone I can call? Anyone who can stop this?" Arthur hesitated. For a decade he had been a ghost. He had walked away from that world, from the titles and the high-stakes games, content to live in quiet anonymity. To make that call would be to resurrect a part of himself he had tried to bury. But then he thought of the boy in the bank, Leo, whose panicked eyes he had seen on the monitor. He thought of the hostages, their lives measured in seconds on Thorne's tactical timeline. And he thought of the gunshot, not as an act of aggression but as a scream of pure terror. His own past, his own failure, demanded he act. He looked at Miller, the earnest young officer who had remembered him. "There is one person," Arthur said, the words slow and deliberate. He gave Miller a name, Deputy Director Evans, and then a number, memorized, a direct line that bypassed all official channels. Tell him Arthur Finch is here, and tell him it's about the Nightingale." As Officer Miller scrambled away, fumbling for his personal cell phone, the world around Arthur seemed to dissolve. The cacophony of the present, the shouting, the radio static, the thrumming tension, faded into a dull, distant roar. He was falling backward in time, pulled into the vortex of a memory he had spent 10 years trying to escape. The smell of asphalt and coffee was replaced by the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The flashing red and blue lights became the cold, sterile floodlights of a different siege, illuminating a remote cabin in the Pacific Northwest. He was younger then, confident. His voice was clear and strong, a finely tuned instrument of persuasion. He was the golden boy of the FBW's hostage negotiation unit, with an unbroken string of successes. The man in the cabin was a father who had lost custody of his daughter. He was armed and desperate. Arthur was on the phone with him, using the playbook, the techniques he himself had helped to write. He was building rapport, making promises, controlling the conversation. He was winning. He was so sure he was winning. He remembered looking up from his post and seeing the little girl's face in the window. She was 6 years old. She had a pink ribbon in her hair. She wasn't crying. She was just watching him, her expression trusting. He had given her a small, reassuring smile, a promise, an arrogant promise. He told the tactical commander to hold, that he was minutes away from a peaceful resolution. But he had misread the father's silence. He had mistaken despair for compliance. He had listened to the words, but he had failed to hear the shattering of a human soul. The single gunshot that followed was not loud. It was a small, contained pop, almost insignificant against the vast silence of the forest. But for Arthur, it was a sonic boom that tore his world apart, the sound that ripped a hole in his life. The little girl's face vanished from the window. The operation was a failure. The Nightingale, the code name for the little girl, was gone. In the aftermath, there was no blame. The official review board cleared him. They called it a tragedy, unavoidable. But Arthur knew the truth. His confidence had been a liability. His smooth, easy voice had been a mask for a lack of true empathy. He had been performing a technique, not connecting with a person. The guilt was a physical thing, a stone in his throat. He tried to speak at the debriefing to explain his failure, but the words wouldn't come. They caught in his throat, tangled and broken. The first stutter was a shock. The doctors called it a psychosomatic trauma response. For Arthur, it was a penance, a scar. He resigned from the bureau a week later, trading his title and his certainty for a life of silence and reflection. His stutter became his teacher. It forced him to be patient. It forced him to weigh every word. It forced him to listen, truly listen, to the spaces between the words, to the language of fear and pain that had no vocabulary. The Nightingale was his greatest failure, but it had also been his crucible, burning away his arrogance and leaving behind the pure, unvarnished core of empathy. It was the source of his quiet strength. The call from Officer Miller's cell phone went to a secure line that rang on a desk in the Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. Deputy Director Robert Evans was in the middle of a briefing on national security threats, a world of abstract dangers and global strategies. He was a man who lived in a world of acronyms and clearance levels, a figure of immense power and influence. He was about to dismiss the call from an unknown number when his aide showed him the text Miller had sent as a follow-up. Arthur Finch. Nightingale. Evans froze. The blood drained from his face. The names were ghosts from another lifetime. Arthur Finch was his mentor, the man who had plucked him from a field office and seen something in him. Arthur was a legend, a phantom who had vanished a decade ago. And Nightingale. That was the code for the wound they all shared, the one failure that haunted the hostage rescue team's unofficial history. It was a name spoken only in whispers, a byword for the catastrophic cost of a single miscalculation. Without a word of explanation to the stunned cabinet secretaries around him, Evans stood up, took the phone, and walked out of the room. He answered on the second ring. Miller's frantic, tumbling words poured out. The bank, the stutter, the SWAT commander, the breach. Evans listened, his mind processing the information with terrifying speed. He didn't need details. The name and the code word told him everything. Arthur wouldn't be there unless it was critical, and he wouldn't use that code unless a profound injustice was about to occur, a repeat of the past. Son, what is your name? Evans' voice was preternaturally calm, yet carried an authority that cut through Miller's panic. Miller, sir. Officer Miller. Officer Miller, you listened to me very carefully, Evans commanded. You have done the right thing. Now, your job is to keep Arthur Finch safe and away from that commander. Do not let them touch him. Do not let them take the radio. I am inbound. I want eyes on Arthur until I am on the ground. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Miller breathed. And, officer, Evans added, his voice dropping to an iron whisper, under no circumstances are you to allow that team to breach. Stand in front of the door yourself if you have to. I will personally vindicate any action you take. Am I clear? Crystal, sir. Evans hung up. He was already moving, his aide running to keep up. "Get me a pilot, now. Divert the training chopper from Quantico. Tell them it's a broken arrow protocol. Top priority. I want to be in the air in 5 minutes." A broken arrow was a directive for a lost nuclear weapon. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would part traffic in the sky and on the ground. A lie that would give him the speed he needed. The best negotiator in the world was in trouble, and the institution he had built, the very people he had trained, were about to mobilize with the full terrifying force of the federal government, not to take down a bank robber, but to save one of their own from the ignorance of a local hothead. An unmarked, state-of-the-art Sikorsky HH-60 Pave Hawk, a black specter of military power, banked sharply in the sky over Virginia, abandoning its training exercise and turning its nose toward the unfolding drama hundreds of miles away. It was coming. The 2-minute warning had become 1 minute. The SWAT team members were in position, crouched like predatory cats, their bodies taut with adrenaline. They were shadows against the brick walls of the alley, phantoms at the edge of the sun-drenched street. Commander Thorne stood in the center of the road, a conductor about to unleash a symphony of violence. He held the radio to his mouth, his thumb hovering over the transmit button to give the final, irrevocable order. 30 seconds, he announced, his voice tight with anticipation. The world seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick and heavy. Then came the sound. It started as a faint rhythmic chopping, a distant heartbeat in the sky. Thorne frowned, annoyed by the distraction. The sound grew rapidly, swelling from a whisper to a rumble to a deafening, percussive roar that vibrated in the bones of everyone on the street. Heads turned upward. The sun was momentarily blotted out by a dark, menacing shape. The black Sikorsky helicopter, unmarked save for a small discreet American flag on its tail, descended with terrifying speed and precision. It did not circle. It did not wait for clearance. It simply dropped out of the sky as if the street below belonged to it. The downdraft was a physical assault, a hurricane of wind and dust that sent hats, papers, and loose debris flying. It tore at clothing and forced officers to shield their eyes. The sheer audacity of the landing was breathtaking. The helicopter settled onto the asphalt directly between the command post and the bank, its massive rotors scything the air just feet above the parked police cruisers. It was an act of supreme, unquestionable dominance. The SWAT team, which seconds before had been the apex predators of this concrete jungle, now looked small, insignificant, frozen in their attack postures by the sheer shock of the arrival. The roar of the engines began to subside, but before they had fully spooled down, a side door slid open with a smooth, hydraulic hiss. 2 men in full black tactical gear, FBIHRT emblazoned in stark white letters on their chests, stepped out. They moved with a fluid, lethal grace, their weapons held in a low, ready position as they scanned the area, their eyes missing nothing. They were not police officers. They were soldiers operating in a civilian world. Then a third figure appeared in the doorway and stepped down onto the street. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, a stark contrast to the uniforms and tactical gear around him. It was Deputy Director Evans. He was calm, his face an unreadable mask of authority, his presence instantly shifting the entire balance of power on the street. Commander Thorne, his face a mask of bewildered fury, strode toward the helicopter, his hand held up. "Who the hell are you people? This is a restricted scene. I am in command here. You land this thing one more time." His voice, which had boomed with such authority just moments before, now sounded reedy and pathetic against the fading whine of the turbines. Deputy Director Evans did not even glance at him. It was the most profound insult he could have delivered. His eyes, cold and sharp as shards of ice, scanned the chaos of the scene, moving past the SWAT officers, past the cruisers, past the command post. He was looking for one person. His gaze swept over the crowd, and then it locked onto the quiet, unassuming figure of Arthur Finch, who was standing beside a pale but resolute Officer Miller. A switch flipped. The cold, hard mask of the director vanished, replaced by something else. relief, concern, and a deep, abiding respect. Evans ignored Thorne's sputtering protests as if he were a piece of street furniture. He walked directly toward Arthur, his steps measured and purposeful. The two HRT operators fell into position behind him, forming a silent, intimidating escort. The crowd of police officers parted before him like the Red Sea. When he reached Arthur, Evans stopped. The entire street was watching, wrapped in a stunned, absolute silence. In front of the SWAT commander he had just ignored, in front of the dozens of officers who had witnessed Arthur's humiliation, in front of the man who was about to order a deadly assault, Deputy Director Evans extended his hand. "Arthur," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. It was filled with a warmth that was startling in its sincerity. "It's been too long." He gripped Arthur's hand firmly. Then, leaning in slightly, his voice dropped, laced with genuine worry. "Are you all right? They didn't interfere?" The gesture was a lightning bolt. It was a public coronation. In that single, simple act of respect, Evans dismantled Thorne's authority more completely than any official order ever could. Thorne's jaw, which had been set in a line of arrogant defiance, literally fell open. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, mottled white. The smirks on the faces of his men had long since evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief and a dawning, sickening horror. They had not just mocked a civilian. They had mocked a king in exile. Thorne finally found his voice, a strangled, incredulous squawk. "You know this? This man?" Evans turned to him at last. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a glacial fury that was terrifying to behold. "Commander," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "this man is Arthur Finch, and the fact that you don't know that name tells me everything I need to know about your incompetence." He let the words hang in the air, a public indictment. Then he continued, his voice rising, each word a hammer blow of truth. "You were about to send your men into a meat grinder, to get them and innocent people killed, because you were too arrogant and too ignorant to listen to the single greatest crisis negotiator this country has ever produced." He gestured with an open palm toward Arthur, a gesture of presentation. "This is the man who wrote the book on empathetic de-escalation, the man who created the protocols your trainers probably skimmed on their way to the firing range. He taught me, and nearly every other senior negotiator in the Bureau, everything we know about saving lives with words." Evans took a step closer to the now trembling Thorne. "You heard the code Nightingale invoked. You should know what that means. But you don't, do you? It was the one time he failed, the one soul he couldn't save. And that failure, a tragedy that would have broken a lesser man, cost him his clear voice, but it forged him into something better. It taught him that true strength isn't about breaking down doors, but about finding the key to open them. It is a lesson you have clearly never learned." Evans' voice reached a crescendo, echoing in the silent street. "You stood here and you mocked his voice. You mocked his compassion. You mocked the very qualities that have saved more lives than all the bullets your department has ever fired. You are a disgrace to your badge." He paused, letting the weight of his condemnation settle. "Now, give me your radio. You are relieved of command. This is a federal scene now." Thorne was shrinking, visibly deflating inside his oversized tactical vest. The man who had been a titan of authority minutes ago now looked like a small, pathetic child being scolded. His face had gone from white to a blotchy, sick-looking red. His hands trembled as he unclipped the radio from his vest. He didn't look at Evans. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the ground, on the ruins of his career and his ego. Evans took the radio from Thorne's shaking hand without a word. He didn't gloat. He simply turned his back on the broken man and faced Arthur. He held out the radio, an offering, a transfer of power. "The floor is yours, old friend," he said softly. "Do what you do best." Arthur took the radio. His hand was rock steady. The weight of it was familiar, a tool he had put down long ago. He looked past Evans. past the stunned faces of the SWAT team, and his gaze settled on the impassive granite of the bank. He was not thinking of Thorne, or of his own vindication. He was thinking only of the terrified young man inside. He was thinking of Leo. He lifted the radio to his lips and keyed the mic. A soft click, and then silence. The entire street, a federal director, 2 HRT operators, and dozens of police officers leaned in, waiting. Arthur took a slow, centering breath. "Oh, Leo," he began. His voice, transmitted across the airwaves, was just as it was. The stutter was there, a familiar halting rhythm. It was not the voice of a commander. It was the voice of a human being. My name is Arthur. I'm outside, and I hear you." He paused. I'm listening." There was no demand, no command, no threat, just a simple, profound statement of validation. Inside the bank, Leo, who had been spiraling into a vortex of paranoia and fear, expecting the thunderous crash of a breach at any second, heard this strange, broken voice. It was so different from the others, from the hard, commanding voices that had been shouting at him. This voice was quiet. It was patient. It was safe. For the next hour, Arthur talked, or rather, he listened. He asked gentle, open-ended questions. Tell me what's happening, Leo. Tell me what you're afraid of." He used his stutter not as a handicap, but as a bridge. The pauses it created gave Leo time to think. The effort it took for Arthur to speak conveyed a vulnerability, an authenticity that no smooth-talking negotiator could ever fake. It showed Leo that this man was willing to struggle for him, to fight to get the words out just for him. It was an act of profound respect. Arthur didn't talk about the hostages, or the gun, or the consequences. He talked about Leo. He learned about the lost job, the eviction notice, the sick mother whose medication he couldn't afford. He unraveled the tapestry of desperation that had led to this moment. He gave Leo's pain a name. He gave it a voice. With every halting phrase, Arthur was building a sanctuary of words, a safe place in the middle of a siege where Leo could finally put down the crushing weight of his fear. Commander Thorne, now just a man named Thorne, stood alone, forgotten in the middle of the street. He was forced to listen to the masterclass in empathy being broadcast over every police radio. He heard the quiet power he had mocked, the patient strength he had dismissed as weakness. Every gentle, stuttered word from Arthur was another nail in the coffin of his own arrogance. His men, who had laughed with him, now refused to meet his eye. They were listening too, their faces a mixture of awe and deep, profound shame. They were learning the lesson that Thorne never had. Finally, after an hour that felt like a lifetime, a new sound came over the radio. It was the sound of a man weeping, deep, ragged, soul-cleansing sobs. "I'm sorry," Leo cried, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do." "I know, Leo." Arthur's voice came back, impossibly gentle. "I know. But you can do the right thing now, Jay. Just walk out slowly. Leave the gun on the counter. No one is going to hurt you. I promise." A few moments later, the heavy glass door of the bank swung open. A young man, his face streaked with tears and dirt, stumbled out into the sunlight. His hands were empty and held high above his head. He blinked, bewildered, and then slowly sank to his knees, his body shaking with sobs of pure relief. The siege was over. The hostages walked out moments later, shaken but unharmed. A wave of relieved applause and cheers rippled through the crowd of onlookers and officers, a spontaneous tribute not to the armored might of the SWAT team, but to the quiet, stuttering man who had won the day with nothing but his voice and his heart. In the immediate aftermath, a kind of stunned order reasserted itself. Paramedics rushed to the now sobbing Leo and the shaken hostages. Officers began securing the scene, their movements lacking the sharp, aggressive edge they'd had before. They moved with a newfound quietness, their eyes continually drifting toward Arthur Finch. Thorne, a ghost at the feast, was approached by a grim-faced internal affairs captain and quietly told he was being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. He didn't protest. He simply nodded, his face a hollow mask, and allowed himself to be led away, stripped of his gear, his rank, and his identity. Deputy Director Evans placed a firm, protective hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Let's get you out of here, old friend," he said, his voice low. "You've done enough." The two HRT operators moved in, creating a subtle but impenetrable cordon around Arthur, shielding him from the inevitable swarm of news cameras and reporters that were now breaking through the outer perimeter. They guided him toward the waiting black helicopter, a silent honor guard. Just before he stepped up into the cabin, Arthur paused. He turned and looked back across the chaotic scene. His eyes found Thorne, standing beside a patrol car, looking utterly defeated and alone. Their gazes met across the distance. Arthur saw a broken man, stripped bare of the armor of his ego. There was no triumph in Arthur's expression, no flicker of, "I told you so." There was only a deep, profound sadness, a sorrow for a man so blinded by his own perceived strength that he could not see the humanity in others, or in himself. Arthur gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. Then he turned away and boarded the helicopter. The door slid shut, and with a rising roar, the black chopper lifted off, leaving the scene and its wreckage behind. The fallout for Thorne was swift and brutal. An internal investigation, spearheaded by a joint task force at the direct, non-negotiable request of the FBI, became a systematic dismantling of his career. It was not just about his conduct at the bank standoff, it was about a documented pattern of behavior. The inquiry uncovered years of complaints about his arrogance, his dismissal of negotiation protocols, and his cultivation of a warrior cop culture that prioritized force over communication. Officer Miller's testimony was the linchpin, a clear-eyed account of Thorne's public mockery and reckless endangerment. Thorne was formally stripped of his command, publicly censured, and demoted to the lowest possible rank. His career as a field officer was over. He was reassigned to the cold, fluorescent silence of the Central Evidence Warehouse, a bureaucratic dungeon where his job was to catalog and log seized property. He, the man of action, was condemned to a life of paperwork and quiet obsolescence. His story became a legend of a different sort at the police academy, a cautionary tale taught to every new recruit, a vivid illustration of how ego can be a more dangerous weapon than any gun. The incident, however, had ripples that spread far beyond one man's disgrace. The media, fascinated by the story of the stuttering savant, dubbed his approach the Finch method. News reports and editorials sparked a national conversation about the militarization of police and the role of de-escalation. Under pressure, police departments across the country began to review their SWAT and crisis negotiation training. Deputy Director Evans, leveraging the full weight of the FBI's influence, established a new mandatory training module for all federal and state-level crisis teams. It was named the Nightingale Protocol, in a quiet tribute to Arthur's past. It centered on the principles Arthur had embodied: radical empathy, non-judgmental listening, and the strategic use of vulnerability to build trust. The core tenet was simple but revolutionary. The primary goal was not to control a situation, but to connect with the human being at its center. Listening, the protocol taught, was not a passive act but an active, tactical tool. A year passed. The world moved on. In a quiet suburb, a man in a rumpled, ill-fitting security guard uniform stood nervously outside a small community center. It was Thorne. The year had stripped him of more than just his rank. The hard muscle had softened, the arrogant posture had stooped into a permanent cringe of humility. He looked older, tired, the fire in his eyes long since extinguished, leaving behind only the gray ash of regret. He checked his watch, his hands trembling slightly. He had been waiting for nearly an hour. The door of the community center opened and Arthur Finch stepped out. He had been inside volunteering, helping a group of troubled teenagers with a public speaking workshop. He saw Thorne and stopped, his expression unreadable. Thorne took a hesitant step forward, his head bowed. He looked like a supplicant before a king. "Mr. Finch," he began, his voice rough and unused to expressing humility. I know you don't have any reason to listen to me, but I had to find you. I had to say it." He looked up, and for the first time, Arthur saw the man's eyes, no longer hidden behind mirrored shades. They were filled with a desperate, pleading shame. "I'm sorry," Thorne whispered, "for everything, for how I treated you, for what I almost did. I was a fool, a proud, arrogant fool. You were right about everything. I was wrong." Arthur stood for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. He looked at this man, this ghost of the Titan who had humiliated him. He saw the cheap uniform, the weary lines on his face, the utter absence of pride. He heard the sincerity in his broken voice. He did not offer the easy comfort of forgiveness. That was not his to give. Instead, he asked a question, his own voice a slow, deliberate counterpoint to Thorne's desperation. Are you a better man today?" Arthur asked, "than you were a year ago?" Thorne's eyes filled with tears. He could only manage a choked nod. "I'm trying to be," he rasped. "Every day. I'm trying to listen." Arthur considered this. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own. "Then," he said softly, "that is what matters." He did not offer absolution, but something far more valuable, a recognition of the journey, a path forward. He turned and walked away, leaving Thorne standing alone on the sidewalk, weeping not in shame, but in the painful, dawning light of a possible redemption. Arthur Finch never returned to the world of flashing lights and high-stakes negotiation. He politely but firmly refused the dozens of interview requests, the lucrative book deals, the offers to become a paid consultant. His vindication had been public, but his life remained private. He had not sought a stage. He had simply done what was right. However, his work was not finished. Quietly, using funds from a new foundation established by an anonymous donor, a foundation Arthur knew was Robert Evans' doing, he opened a small, unassuming clinic in a converted storefront. The sign on the door was simple: the Nightingale Center for Voice and Listening. It was a place for people who had lost their way and their voice to trauma. Veterans grappling with the ghosts of war, first responders worn down by the weight of what they'd seen, ordinary people shattered by loss or fear. Arthur didn't treat them. He sat with them. He listened to their silences. He shared his own brokenness, his own story, his own stutter. He taught them that a wound did not have to be an ending, that sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in. He remained a quiet paragon, a humble hero who had vanished when the work was done, his life a testament to the profound and unshakable truth that the greatest strength is often born from the deepest wound, and the most powerful voice is the one that knows how to listen.